Hi, I'm going to be doing something a little different this time. I'm going to be reviewing two books at the same time. They're both about the same subject, and I just wanted to kind of compare and contrast them and give you what I thought of them. The first book I read is by Peter Hopkirk, and it's called Like Hidden Fire, The Plot to Bring Down the British Empire. And this is a fascinating book about the turn that the Great Game took during the First World War. A lot of historians will say that the Great Game ended in the early 1900s, but that just isn't true. It just transformed into something very different and continued on almost really until now. It's continued up until now, but it transformed in the First World War from a battle between Britain and Russia for control of Central Asia to a battle between Germany on one side with Turkey and Britain and Russia on the other side. It's kind of humbling to realize something when reading this book, that the three most horrendous, brutal, miserable political systems that have ever been created in the 20th century came from the Second Reich, from the Wilhelmine Germany, the one that fought World War I. And we all know that Nazism came out of the ashes of the Second Reich during the Weimar years, after the Second Reich had already ended, admittedly. That one's easy enough to see, but we also have to look at Bolshevism, the horrendous Soviet communism that ended up killing tens of millions of people, was created by Germany during the war, the greatest intelligence success of the First World War, maybe of all time, came when the Germans managed to inject the bacillus of Bolshevism, as Winston Churchill so brilliantly put it, into Russia at their weakest point to tear them out of the war. And it did accomplish this one tactical victory, but it created this horrendous, violent system that ended up paying back the Germans in kind a few decades later. They created their own monster. That one is a little bit more complicated to see it as a German, as the fault of the Second Reich, but the third one is probably the most controversial. It's the one that most people would never have thought of, but international Islamic terrorism. Yes, as hard as it may be to believe, that was created in Germany during the First World War. Now, maybe it isn't fair to say it was created in Germany, because it certainly mutated after the Second World War into something very different that's much more familiar to us today, but admittedly the idea of an Islamist assault on Western civilization, a jihad against the West going across the entire world, from North Africa to India and beyond, came from the Second Reich. It came from Kaiser Wilhelm's intelligence agents, who decided to do something extraordinarily irresponsible during the First World War. They decided to use Turkey's entrance into the war and the position of Caliph, which was still around in Turkey, to declare a jihad against Britain and Russia. And this jihad was as horrendous as you might imagine. It was to include women and children, even though in theory they kinda tried to not do that, but it was going to include women and children and civilians of all kinds in this brutal uprising. They were trying to stir up a hornet's nest of Muslim anti-Westernism throughout the Middle East, India, and Central Asia. And it's just a fascinating story from start to finish. The book tells a number of different stories of different people that were involved in this, including someone who was known as the German Lawrence, as in Lawrence of Arabia. One of the things that they were trying to do is to create that perpetual bugbear of the Great Game, to launch the hosts of Afghanistan down into India to ravage and pillage and kill people, and eventually help to undermine and destroy the British Raj. Pretty much the entire thesis behind the Great Game in the 19th century. The Germans were attempting to make their way to Afghanistan in order to create this. Their journey is heroic, fascinating, terrifying, and ultimately totally futile. Remember, it wasn't just a matter of hopping on a plane back in those days. This is 1914 to 1918 we're talking about. They had to walk there. They couldn't go in any ships because the British controlled the oceans for the most part, and getting across hostile territory in Persia, which the British and the British and the Russians had practically divided amongst themselves during the war, was no easy feat. It's fascinating to hear about their journey across Persia through Afghanistan, trying to get the trying to get the Afghans to try to invade India, which was totally futile. The Afghans had no confidence in the Germans that they were going to be able to do this. They had no reason to believe that they were going to be they were going to be successful in this, that it was going to be any use. Another part of this is that the Germans tried to use Indian extremists in the British Raj to stir up the flames of holy war against their British rulers. And it really brings up a fascinating point about all this, which is the country with the largest number of Muslims in it at the time was the British Empire, by far. And the second one was the Russians. The British had India and huge areas in Africa, which were Muslim, and the second one was the Russian Empire. So they were really the most vulnerable. You know, the Turkey comes in a distant third in the number of Muslims at this time. And it really was a fascinating attempt to play dirty. You know, the Germans were really interested in breaking as many rules of war as they possibly could during this era. And I'm going to talk about that in a later review of another book, believe me. But they really were trying to do something that was absolutely horrid. They were trying to stir up race riots in India and throughout the British and Russian empires, and that is horrendous. They were trying to get Muslims to indiscriminately murder Westerners, that they were trying to stir up a hornet's nest of Muslim terrorists in India, the British, and the rest of the British and Russian empires. And thankfully, this never happened. It did not work. The Muslims stayed overwhelmingly loyal to the British and the Russians during the war and did not end up attacking them. Only a few extremists in the Indians that they talk about in this book tried to set up terror cells and bring in weapons and bring in propaganda from other countries, like trying to bring in weapons from the neutral United States and getting them involved in this entire terrorist situation. It's really a fascinating story. I like this book because it presents a different side of the First World War. We're used to, in the First World War, thinking of it as a grim, bloody, mud-strewn affair of stalemate in Western Europe, and that's obviously absolutely true, but there were other aspects of the war, very important aspects of the war, especially in their relation to later events. The Balfour Declaration was issued around this time during the First World War, which still affects our world every single day because of our relations with the Middle East. And just the relation that we have with the Middle East in general stems from the First World War, and this is a vital aspect of that war. And it's really exciting to read about it, to see another side of the war, the desert version of the war. And I've been interested in Lawrence of Arabia ever since I'd seen the movie, but I hadn't really heard very much about the Germans trying to do something during this war that was similar, although far more bloodthirsty and cruel than the British were trying to do, obviously, because the British were not trying to create a vicious uprising against civilians of Muslim terrorists. They were trying to send Arabs to liberate themselves from the Turks. Obviously, that didn't end with the Arabs having anything but nominal independence in many areas from the British and French, but still, it was a lot better than what the Germans were trying to do, which was deliberately stir up terrorist violence. The other book that I'm going to talk about is this one, The Berlin to Baghdad Express by Sean McMeekin. This essentially tells the same story about the Muslims and Germans and the international jihad and their attempts to invade India and etc., etc. This one I bought because I thought that it was going to be, by the title, a lot more about the prelude to what happened. The story of how the Ottoman Empire went from being very friendly towards Great Britain to being very friendly towards Germany is a fascinating one, and involves brutal massacres of Christian populations that turned the British public away from the Ottomans, and the Germans charged right in. Again, they believed in realpolitik, even after Bismarck. They didn't care about the bloody massacres of tens of thousands of Christians. They didn't care about that. They saw the British leaving, and they moved right in to take over and exert their influence over the Ottoman Empire. One of the things that this book does a lot better than like Hidden Fire was to go into these stories of the changing of the Ottoman Empire at that time from the Young Turks in the teens, and after the story a little bit about the early 20s and how the modern nation-state of Turkey was created out of the ashes of the medieval-style empire of the Ottomans. It doesn't go into as much detail as I'd like. I think it should have gone into more, especially because the title seems to make it more about the early days and the lead-up to that, rather than the Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east, that the Germans were trying to accomplish at the time, to create a vast empire stretching from Berlin to Constantinople to Baghdad to India eventually. I do think this is an important story to be told. I do think the Germans somehow, if they would have been able to control the Middle East, would have been far more brutal than the British and French were in their rule. And the British and French weren't nice, exactly, but the Germans would have been much, much worse. This book, I think, suffers from the fact that it is a little bit too nice towards the Ottomans. I do think that there were heroes and villains in the First World War, just like in the Second World War, and Turkey, the prison of nations, as it and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were called, was definitely one of the villains during the war. And not just against the Arabs or the Europeans, but against its own people. I think he sees things a little bit too much from the Turkish perspective, rather than from the Allied perspective, which I would have preferred. This book does go into a lot more detail about events west of Arabia, where the Turks also tried to stir up trouble in the Sudan, which was owned by Britain at the time, and in Tunisia and other parts of North Africa, which failed even more badly than their attempts in Afghanistan did. This book does have a fascinating epilogue called The Strange Death of German Zionism and the Nazi-Muslim Connection, which again paints a pretty favorable look at Germany in terms of Jews at the time, and tries to show how it was corrupted during the First World War. Not something I necessarily ascribe to. I think anti-Semitism was deeply rooted in Germany even before the First World War. Again, he's being very nice to the Central Powers, which I don't think he necessarily should be. But it's still very interesting to read. Ultimately, though, I would say that if you want one of these books, go with this book, like Hidden Fire by Peter Hopkirk. It's a little bit quicker, it's easier to read, it doesn't have as much background, but then again, this doesn't have all that much background. If you want the background to it, you gotta get a book about Turkey from, essentially from the time of the Tanzimat to 1914. That's what you gotta get, and there are books out there like that that are really good. You're just not getting enough at the beginning from what I wanted about Turco-German relations at the time. Although it does have significantly more than this book does, which has very little. Just a really brief overview of a few pages at the beginning, really 20-30 pages at the beginning. This book is also much more exciting. It's written much more like an adventure, whereas this one's a little bit more clinical about what's happened. And really, I think if you want the best bang for your buck, you're going to go for this one right here, like Hidden Fire, like Peter Hopkirk. It was released under another name, which is On Secret Service East of Constantinople, and that's what I've seen it listed as on websites now, so I think they're using that name more than Like Hidden Fire, even though Like Hidden Fire is a much catchier and a much better name, and I like it a lot. But this is really the book you want to go for. But if you're interested in this period like I was, read both of these books. I thought they were both very interesting, and I liked reading both of them. But if you had to pick one that you wanted to read about this time period, go with the one by Peter Hopkirk, Like Hidden Fire.